My name's Harry, I'm 28, and a week before what should have been the happiest day of my life, I overheard the kind of conversation that makes your stomach drop and your pulse hammer like you just sprinted uphill. I wasn't snooping, I wasn't creeping around the house like some spy. I was just walking down the hall of my parents' home after dropping off a box of decorations my fiancé and I had planned for the rehearsal dinner. That's when I caught the sound of laughter, muffled but distinct, and my name being tossed around like the punchline of a joke. I paused, thinking maybe they were telling some embarrassing childhood story. You know, the type families drag out for light-hearted laughs. But what I heard next froze me mid-step. Wait until the toasts, my older cousin Mark snickered. We'll make him look like a joke in front of his bride. Can you imagine her face? The laughter that followed wasn't friendly. It was sharp, mean, the kind of laughter that comes from people who enjoy cutting someone down. I don't think I breathed for a solid 10 seconds. My fiancée, Claire, and I had been planning this wedding for months. We weren't throwing some massive, over-the-top event. We wanted it intimate, personal, something that reflected us. And here was my family, my own family, plotting to humiliate me on one of the most important days of my life. To understand why that moment hit me so hard, I should back up a little. I grew up as the middle child in a family where my older brother, Ryan, was the golden boy, and my younger sister, Julia, was the princess. Me? I was the filler child, the one they barely noticed unless I was doing something wrong or inconveniencing them. Ryan was the athlete, captain of the football team, my parents' pride. Julia was the sweet one, doted on and excused for everything. I was just Harry. Quiet, average Harry. But I made peace with it over the years. Or at least I thought I had. I went to college on scholarships, worked jobs nobody else in the family would touch, and built my career from scratch. I met Claire, who saw me, really saw me, for the first time in my life, and I thought maybe, just maybe, my family would finally respect me once they saw what I'd built for myself. Instead, old patterns never seemed to die. At family dinners, Ryan still dominated every conversation, interrupting me if I so much as tried to share a story. Julia had a way of dismissing anything I said with a little smirk, as though my words were background noise. My parents, well, they'd just smile and redirect attention back to the stars of the family. I learned to keep quiet, to avoid stirring the pot, to just get through visits without expecting anything. Still, part of me hoped my wedding would be different. I hoped they'd realize this was my moment. So hearing them laugh about turning the toasts, the one tradition meant to honor the couple, into some kind of cruel joke, that cut deeper than I can explain. It wasn't just embarrassment they were planning. It was sabotage. I stood there in the hallway, gripping the stair rail, feeling this strange mixture of anger and disbelief. Were they really so bored, so petty, that they'd ruin my wedding for a laugh? And more than that, what did it say about the years of small slights I'd brushed off? Maybe those hadn't been harmless after all. Maybe they'd always taken pleasure in making me the butt of the joke. I went back to the car that night and sat in silence before I even drove off. Claire had texted me asking how it went, and I couldn't bring myself to tell her. Not yet. The thought of her walking into that reception, hearing my own family cut me down in front of her friends, her relatives, everyone we'd invited, it made me sick. That night, lying awake in bed, the laughter replayed in my head on a loop. We'll make him look like a joke in front of his bride. I could still hear Ryan's voice layered over it, Julia's snicker, Mark's chuckle. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just sad. I was angry. Truly, deeply angry. It was then that I realized something important. I couldn't just let it happen. Not this time. Not when everything I'd worked for, the respect I'd built, the life Claire and I were starting, was at stake. I'd spent years letting them walk over me, pretending it didn't matter. But this was my wedding, my day, and if they thought they were going to use it to humiliate me, they had another thing coming. I didn't have a plan yet, but the seed had been planted. As the days crept closer to the wedding, every fake smile at the rehearsal dinner, every patronizing pat on the back from Ryan, every sly look from Julia only fueled the fire. They thought they had me figured out, quiet Harry, who wouldn't dare speak up. But they didn't know I had been listening, and they had no idea what I was about to do. The morning after overhearing that conversation, I woke up with that same knot in my stomach. I stared at the ceiling, Claire's steady breathing beside me, and thought about saying something to her. But every time I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. What was I supposed to say? Hey, by the way, My family is planning to humiliate me during our wedding speeches. Sleep well. It sounded paranoid, petty even. Part of me almost gaslit myself into thinking maybe I'd misheard. Maybe they weren't serious. But the more I replayed it in my head, the clearer it became. The cadence of their laughter, the smugness in Ryan's tone, Julia's little snort. No, they weren't joking in that harmless, teasing way families sometimes do. They meant it. And if I ignored it, I knew I'd regret it. I tried to focus on work that week, but every email I typed, every call I took, my mind kept drifting back to those words. We'll make him look like a joke in front of his bride. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for Thursday evening. Claire was buzzing with excitement all week, gushing about how everything was finally falling into place. And while she fussed over last-minute details like flower arrangements and place cards, I carried this silent weight. Every smile I gave her felt forced. I hated myself for it, but I didn't want to ruin her happiness with the storm brewing in my head. By the time Thursday rolled around, I'd convinced myself to observe, not react, not expose what I knew. I wanted to see if they'd slip up, maybe even test the waters of their plan. The rehearsal itself went smoothly enough. The pastor was patient as we fumbled through walking down the aisle. My groomsmen cracked jokes. Claire's family offered nothing but warmth. For a brief moment, I almost forgot. But then came dinner. We gathered in the banquet room my parents had insisted on booking, our treat. Mom had said with that tone that made it clear it wasn't about generosity, it was about control. I should have known it would be a mistake to let them handle anything. The room was beautiful, sure, but the way they strutted around, it was as if they were hosting, not celebrating me and Claire. I sat beside Claire at the long table while Ryan launched into one of his endless stories about his college glory days. He'd already told the same one at least 3 times at previous family gatherings, but this time he exaggerated it so much that even Mark and Julia were in stitches. Remember that game where I scored the winning touchdown? Whole crowd chanting my name. Harry was on the sidelines. Weren't you? Ryan's grin widened as he looked at me. Yeah, you were the water boy that year, right? The table erupted in laughter. Claire shifted uncomfortably beside me, her hand brushing mine under the table. I forced a smile, but inside, my teeth clenched so hard I thought they might crack. It was such a small jab, right? A stupid high school memory no one but him cared about anymore. But it wasn't about the memory. It was about putting me in my place, reminding everyone who the real star of the family was. Julia jumped in next, her voice syrupy sweet. Oh, come on, Ryan, don't embarrass him. Harry's had plenty of achievements. She paused, tapping her finger on her chin theatrically. Like, remember that time you won the participation ribbon at the science fair? Another wave of laughter rolled across the table. I glanced at Claire. Her eyes flicked toward me, searching, silently asking if this was normal. And I had no answer that didn't make me sound like a child whining about unfair treatment. So I just sipped my water, letting the burn of humiliation settle deep. But I noticed something then. The way Ryan and Julia shared glances, the way Mark leaned in to whisper to them when the laughter died down. It wasn't random. They were practicing, testing material. The rehearsal dinner wasn't just about running through the ceremony. For them, it was a dress rehearsal for the humiliation they were planning. That realization hit me like a punch. The night dragged on with more of the same. Ryan dominated every conversation, Julia sprinkled in her subtle digs, and my parents. Oh, my parents just beamed with pride at their successful children. Dad clapped Ryan on the back when he launched into yet another story. Mom smiled indulgently when Julia recounted her triumph of landing an internship through one of Dad's connections. Meanwhile, when I mentioned that Claire and I had bought a small starter home earlier in the year, Mom barely blinked. Oh, that's nice, dear, she said before immediately turning the conversation back to Julia's decorating plans for her new apartment. By dessert, my patience was paper thin. Claire leaned over and whispered, "Are you okay? You seem tense." I wanted so badly to tell her everything, but I swallowed it down. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." After everyone left, I lingered behind under the pretense of helping clean up. That's when I caught another snippet of conversation. Ryan and Mark were by the bar, chuckling as they poured themselves another drink. "Man, this is going to be gold," Mark said. "Can't wait to see his face when we roast him. He won't even know what hit him." Ryan smirked. "Yeah, he'll just stand there like he always does, taking it." Same old Harry. My fists tightened at my sides. Same old Harry. The quiet one. The pushover. The family joke. I left that night with a fire in my chest. They weren't just planning a couple of embarrassing anecdotes. They were going to roast me. At my own wedding. In front of Claire, her family, our friends, everyone. And they thought I wouldn't fight back. The next couple of days were torture. Every time my phone buzzed with a message from Mom about seating charts or Julia about bridesmaid dresses, I felt this itch under my skin. My family carried on like everything was normal, smiling in group chats, posting cheerful photos on social media. But beneath it all, I knew what they were plotting. On the morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror in my suit, adjusting the tie Claire had picked. She came up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist. "You look perfect," she said softly, kissing my shoulder. For a moment, her warmth melted the knot in my chest. But then I thought of Ryan's smug grin, Julia's rehearsed smirk, and the laughter that had haunted me all week. My reflection hardened. This was it. The day they thought they'd get the last laugh. But I wasn't the same Harry they remembered, and I wasn't about to let them ruin this. The morning of my wedding should have been filled with nerves of the good kind, the kind that come with anticipation, excitement, and joy. Instead, I woke up with the kind of knot in my chest that felt like it was made of stone. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of traffic outside our hotel window while Claire slept peacefully beside me. She looked so calm, so radiant even in her sleep, and all I could think was, she has no idea what's coming. I wanted to protect her from it. I wanted her to only remember this day as the start of something beautiful. But the echoes of my family's laughter, their smug whispers about the toasts, wouldn't leave me. My chest tightened every time I pictured Claire's face when those words were spoken, when the people who should be supporting us twisted my moment into a circus act. By the time I got dressed and met my groomsmen, my resolve had shifted into something hard and unyielding. I didn't know how I was going to stop them, but I knew I couldn't let them have the satisfaction of blindsiding me. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Claire walked down the aisle, and for a moment, the world stood still. Everything else faded. The whispers, the schemes, the anxiety. It was just her and me, our vows trembling on our lips, our families and friends watching. I could almost convince myself that I'd been wrong, that maybe my family wouldn't dare. But the illusion shattered at the reception. The ballroom glowed with soft lighting, tables lined with white linen and candles flickering gently. People mingled, laughter filled the air, glasses clinked. Claire's parents gave their speeches first, warm and heartfelt, filled with stories that made everyone smile. Claire's mother even teared up talking about how she knew I would cherish her daughter. It was everything a wedding toast should be: supportive, loving, genuine. Then came the moment I'd been dreading. My brother Ryan stood, champagne glass in hand, a smirk already tugging at his lips. "All right, everyone," he said, his voice booming with that obnoxious confidence he'd carried since high school. "I think it's time we talk about the man of the hour, my little brother Harry." The crowd clapped politely. I sat there, jaw tight, Claire's hand resting on mine. Ryan launched into his toast, but it wasn't a toast at all. It was a roast, cruel, cutting, and dressed up as humor. "Now, I've known Harry all my life, obviously," Ryan began, chuckling. "And let me tell you, it's been entertaining. I mean, this is the kid who once tried out for football and couldn't even put his helmet on the right way. Remember that, Dad?" The crowd gave a light laugh. My father grinned, nodding, as if Ryan had brought up some charming memory instead of dragging me down in front of everyone. Ryan continued, his smirk widening with every word. "And then there was the time he wanted to impress a girl at school by singing at the talent show. Poor guy couldn't even hit the notes. The whole gymnasium was wincing. Guess it's a good thing Claire isn't marrying him for his musical abilities, huh?" This time, the laughter was louder. Some people, friends of Ryan's, distant cousins, practically doubled over. I felt my face heat, my pulse thundering in my ears. Claire squeezed my hand under the table, her thumb brushing my knuckles. I could feel her discomfort radiating off her, and that hurt more than the laughter. But Ryan wasn't done. "No, but seriously," he said, holding up a hand as though to pause the chuckles. "I've got to give him credit. Harry always managed to scrape by. Never the star, never the one anyone expected much from. But hey, look at him now. He actually tricked someone into marrying him." The room erupted. The sound of laughter, cruel, cutting, jagged, crashed into me like a tidal wave. I glanced around, searching for an anchor. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Claire's family looked stunned, but my side? My family. They were roaring. Julia covered her mouth with her hand, pretending to stifle her laughter, while Mark slapped the table, tears in his eyes from laughing so hard. My parents? My mother dabbed her eyes, overcome with amusement. My father leaned back, shaking his head, chuckling like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't just Ryan being Ryan. This wasn't harmless sibling ribbing. This was coordinated. They had planned it. Every word, every joke, every humiliating jab. It was their grand finale. The trust I'd clung to, however fragile, shattered. I could almost feel the shift inside me, like a rope snapping after being pulled too tight. I looked at Ryan standing there, basking in the spotlight, and realized that my family had never once seen me as their equal. They didn't respect me, didn't even like me. I was their punching bag, their comic relief. And now, they'd chosen the most important day of my life to drive that truth home. Julia was next. She stood, her glass glittering under the lights, her smirk already rehearsed. "Now, Harry," she said in her sweet, condescending tone, "I just want to say how proud I am of you. Really. I mean, we all thought you'd end up alone with a bunch of cats. But look at you. You found someone who can actually tolerate you. That's incredible." The laughter rolled again. She wasn't even subtle. Her words dripped with cruelty, every compliment a dagger. She added, "Claire, you're a saint. Honestly, I hope you have the patience of an angel because, well, we all know Harry can be difficult, forgetful, clumsy. But hey, marriage is about compromise, right?" I stared at her, disbelief mingling with fury. Claire's cheeks flushed red, and her grip on my hand tightened until her knuckles were white. Mark stood after her, delivering his own string of jabs, stories twisted to make me look foolish, lazy, incapable. At one point, he even imitated me as a teenager, putting on a dopey voice and pretending to trip over his own feet. The laughter from my side of the family was deafening. By the time they sat down, the air in the room felt poisoned. Claire's parents looked horrified. Her siblings exchanged wide-eyed glances, and I sat frozen, humiliated, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me like a physical force. It wasn't just the words. It was the gleeful malice behind them. The way my parents had laughed along. The way every cousin and relative who'd known me since childhood had clapped and hollered as though this was the highlight of the night. They weren't just mocking me. They were mocking Claire too, mocking her choice, mocking the life we were building. That was the breaking point. I sat there, the room spinning around me, and something inside me hardened into steel. The years of slights, the endless dismissals, the casual cruelty, it all funneled into this one moment. This was no longer about surviving their mockery. This was about reclaiming my dignity. And I knew then, without a doubt, that I couldn't stay silent. But before I could even move, Ryan leaned toward my chair and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. "Same old Harry. What are you going to do?" "Nothing." That was the moment the betrayal became complete. It wasn't just the speeches. It was their certainty, their smug, unshakable belief that I would roll over, as I always had. And in that instant, they couldn't have been more wrong. When the laughter finally died down and the clinking of glasses resumed, I sat there frozen, staring at the tablecloth as though it held the answers to a puzzle I couldn't solve. My hands rested stiffly on my lap, my jaw clenched so tight that my molars ached. All I could hear was the echo of Ryan's voice in my head, mocking, smug. "Same old Harry. What are you going to do?" "Nothing." Claire's hand was still gripping mine, but it no longer felt like an anchor. It felt like a reminder of just how exposed I was. I glanced at her, and the look in her eyes nearly broke me. She wasn't embarrassed of me, not exactly, but she was furious on my behalf. Furious that people who were supposed to love me had just publicly dismantled me for their amusement. Furious that I'd sat through it, silent, trying to pretend it wasn't happening. I wanted to say something. Anything. But the words tangled in my throat, trapped behind years of conditioning that told me to swallow the humiliation and move on. That's who I'd always been, after all. The brother who kept quiet. The son who didn't rock the boat. The filler child who absorbed the blows so everyone else could shine. After the toasts ended, the DJ called for music and the dance floor began to fill. The energy of the room shifted. People clapped, couples swayed, Conversations resumed as if nothing unusual had happened. As if my own family hadn't just ripped me apart in front of both sides of the guest list. I sat there in my chair, watching everyone carry on, and for the first time, I felt like a stranger at my own wedding. Claire leaned in, her voice low but sharp. "Harry, why didn't you say anything?" I swallowed hard. What was I supposed to say? Start a fight in the middle of the reception? Her eyes softened, though her grip on my hand didn't. "No, but you can't let them do this to you. You can't let them define how people remember this day." Her words hit me like a stone dropped in still water, rippling outward. She was right. As much as I hated confrontation, as much as I wanted to disappear, I couldn't let their cruelty be the story people told about our wedding. But at that moment, I didn't feel strong. I felt broken. I excused myself under the pretense of using the restroom, slipping away from the noise of the ballroom and into the quiet of the hallway. My legs carried me aimlessly until I found myself outside, the cool night air brushing against my flushed skin. I leaned against the brick wall of the venue, tugging at my tie until it loosened, trying to catch my breath. My phone buzzed in my pocket. When I pulled it out, I saw a message from Julia. "Don't take it so seriously, Harry. We were just having fun. Lighten up, it's your wedding." I stared at the screen, my vision blurring with anger. Fun. That was their word for it. Public humiliation, stripping me down to a joke in front of my wife and her family. That was fun. Another message buzzed in right after, this time from Mark. "Classic. You took it like a champ, though. Same old Harry, huh?" Followed by a string of laughing emojis. The bile rose in my throat. My chest heaved, my fists clenched, and I nearly hurled the phone into the parking lot. But instead, I shoved it back into my pocket and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until stars burst behind my eyelids. This was rock bottom. For years, I'd taken their digs, brushed them off, pretended they didn't matter. But this was different. This wasn't a casual jab at a family dinner. This wasn't a childhood memory spun for laughs. This was my wedding. The day I was supposed to feel celebrated, respected, loved. And they'd stolen it from me. I wanted to disappear, to climb into Claire's car and drive away, leave the reception behind. But then I thought of Claire's parents, who had looked on in horror as the speeches unfolded. I thought of her siblings, who sat stone-faced while my family roared with laughter. I thought of Claire herself, whose cheeks had burned red as she watched her new husband get dismantled piece by piece. No, I couldn't run. If I walked away, then Ryan was right. Julia was right. Mark was right. My parents were right. I would be same old Harry, the boy who stayed quiet, who took it, who let them write the story of my life for me. But I also knew I couldn't just storm back in and blow up the reception. That would only feed into their narrative. Harry the overreactor, Harry the fool, Harry the joke. I had to be smarter than that. So I stood outside for a long time, breathing in the night air, letting the sting of their betrayal settle into something sharper. Not rage, not despair, resolve. When I finally returned to the ballroom, the energy was in full swing. Couples danced, guests laughed, children darted between tables. Claire caught sight of me immediately, her eyes still burning with protective anger. She moved toward me, slipping her arm through mine, grounding me. "You okay?" she asked softly. I forced a small smile. "Not yet, but I will be." She studied me for a moment, as if sensing the shift in my tone, then nodded. As the night dragged on, I played the part of the good host. I greeted guests, smiled for photos, thanked people for coming. But under the surface, my mind was churning, sketching out possibilities, imagining outcomes. Every laugh from my family across the room was fuel to the fire. Every smug glance from Ryan added another stone to the foundation I was quietly building inside myself. I didn't say a word to my parents beyond the polite minimum. My father clapped me on the back, saying, "Great night, son. You've outdone yourself." My mother kissed my cheek and added, "See? Everyone had such a good time. You should be grateful." Grateful. That word nearly undid me. But I swallowed it, smiled thinly, and nodded. Later that night, after the last dance and the final farewell, when Claire and I finally slipped into our hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. She sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "They're not going to stop, Harry," she said quietly. "If they can do this to you today, they'll do it again. And again, unless you stop them." Her words weren't an accusation. They were a truth I'd known but hadn't wanted to face. I nodded slowly, my hands clasped together. I know. For a long moment, we sat there in silence. Then Claire lifted her head, her eyes meeting mine. So, what are you going to do? I looked at her, and though my voice was low, there was steel in it. I'm going to show them they can't treat me like this anymore. Not now. Not ever again. It wasn't a plan yet. Not even close. But it was a promise. To myself, to Claire, to the life we were building. The old Harry had died the moment Ryan leaned down and whispered those words. Same old Harry. What are you going to do? Nothing. And if my family thought I'd sit quietly in the shadow of their cruelty forever, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The weeks after the wedding felt strangely hollow, like a party had ended but the mess was still scattered all over the floor. Claire and I returned from our short honeymoon, but the laughter from that night still echoed in my head like a cruel soundtrack I couldn't turn off. Every time I looked at the wedding photos, I couldn't stop remembering what had happened just out of frame. At first, I avoided my family altogether. I ignored texts, skipped calls, and stayed away from gatherings. They didn't seem to mind. If anything, they carried on like nothing had happened. Ryan posted a photo of him holding a glass at the reception with the caption, "Best toast of the night." Julia uploaded a clip of her speech to Instagram, complete with laughing emojis in the caption. Mark shared a blurry video of himself mocking me on the dance floor with a group of cousins howling in the background. Claire showed me one of those posts and asked gently, "Are you going to say something?" I shook my head. Not yet. Because while my family carried on, convinced they'd won, I had started to shift. Something inside me had cracked that night. Yes, but it had also made space for something new. Something sharper, steadier. For the first time in my life, I wasn't content to stay in the background. I threw myself into work. By day, I was a project manager at a mid-sized tech company. I'd been good at my job, but never spectacular. Never the guy who raised his hand for the big projects. Never the one to step into the spotlight. That changed almost overnight. I stopped playing small. I started volunteering for the complex assignments nobody else wanted. I stayed late, not out of desperation, but out of determination. When the CEO mentioned a new product launch, I positioned myself right in the center of it, coordinating between teams, making sure my fingerprints were all over the success. It didn't take long before people noticed. My boss pulled me aside one afternoon, eyebrows raised. "Harry, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but keep it up. You're becoming indispensable." That word, indispensable, sank deep. It was the opposite of how my family saw me. At work, I wasn't same old Harry. I was essential. Claire noticed too. She'd come home to find me at the dining table with spreadsheets open, not just finishing tasks but reimagining them, improving systems, making things smoother for everyone. She'd smile, kiss the top of my head, and say, "There you are. That's the man I married." Her support became fuel. Outside of work, I started focusing on myself in other ways too. For years, I'd ignored my health, content to coast on whatever scraps of energy I had left at the end of the day. Now, I hit the gym 3 mornings a week before work. At first it was brutal. Every muscle screamed. Every jog on the treadmill felt endless. But slowly, I started to see changes. The mirror reflected broader shoulders, stronger arms, a posture that no longer curled inward. It wasn't just physical. With every workout, every early morning session, I was proving something to myself. I wasn't weak. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't their punchline. By the 6-month mark, everything in my life looked different. At work, I'd been promoted to lead a major department initiative. My salary bumped up, but more importantly, my reputation skyrocketed. Coworkers started coming to me for advice, treating me with respect I'd never experienced from my family. In my personal life, I felt more grounded, more confident. Claire and I had started talking seriously about our long-term goals, maybe expanding our house, maybe even starting a family someday. But with all the growth came a kind of bittersweet realization. My family had no idea. They hadn't been part of any of it. And when they did reach out, it was always self-serving. Mom called one evening, her voice casual as if we hadn't been estranged since the wedding. "Harry, darling, your father and I were thinking, could you take a look at Ryan's resume? He's considering a new position, and you're so good with details." I almost laughed. Ryan, the golden boy, suddenly needed my help. "Sorry, Mom," I said evenly. "I'm swamped with work." Another time, Julia texted me asking if I could pull some strings to get her boyfriend into a training program at my company. I didn't even respond. The old Harry would have jumped at the chance, desperate for approval. The new Harry recognized what it was: manipulation dressed up as family bonding. I kept my distance, building my life brick by brick, until one day, an unexpected opportunity landed in my lap. Through work, I'd been introduced to a startup founder who was looking for investors. It was risky, but something about his pitch lit a fire in me. I crunched the numbers, did my research, and decided to take the leap with some of the savings Claire and I had set aside. For months, I barely breathed a word about it, quietly watching as the company gained traction. By the one-year anniversary of our wedding, the startup had taken off in a way none of us could have predicted. My modest investment had multiplied several times over. Suddenly, I wasn't just financially stable. I was on the cusp of real wealth. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about what it represented. For the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving in the shadow of my family's mockery. I was thriving on my own terms. And as much as I wanted to keep it private, I knew my family wouldn't stay oblivious forever. Word travels fast, especially when money's involved. The first hint came at a family barbecue. Against my better judgment, Claire convinced me to attend. "We don't have to stay long," she said, "but it might be good to show your face." So we went. The atmosphere was the same as always: Ryan holding court with his stories, Julia preening, my parents doting. But this time, I wasn't the quiet shadow in the corner. I stood taller, spoke with confidence, let my voice carry. People noticed. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years asked what I'd been up to, and when I mentioned the startup casually, their eyes lit up. Ryan overheard one of those conversations and swooped in. "Wait, you invested in that?" "No way. How much did you even put in?" I shrugged, deliberately vague. "Enough." His jaw tightened, his smile forced. Julia, standing beside him, tilted her head. "Wow, Harry. That's surprising." Surprising. That word held all the weight of their disbelief. They still couldn't reconcile the version of me they'd mocked at the wedding with the man standing in front of them now. And that's when it hit me. This was the rise. This was the shift. They didn't hold the power anymore. As Claire and I left the barbecue that evening, I glanced back at my family laughing by the fire pit. For once, I didn't feel the sting of exclusion. I felt something else entirely: anticipation. Because I knew this was only the beginning. The boy they'd humiliated at his own wedding was gone. In his place stood a man quietly building something bigger, stronger, unshakable. And sooner or later, they were going to realize just how badly they'd underestimated me. The barbecue was the turning point. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting match, no confrontation, but it shifted something fundamental. For the first time, I could see the way my family's eyes lingered on me differently. There was curiosity there, suspicion even. They couldn't quite pin it down, but they sensed it. I was no longer the easy target they remembered. Of course, in true fashion, they didn't treat it as an opportunity to reconnect. They treated it like a puzzle to solve, a new way to measure me against their own inflated egos. A few weeks later, my mother invited Claire and me to dinner. That alone was unusual. In the past, she'd always insisted family gatherings be big, chaotic affairs, with Ryan and Julia front and center. But this time it was just the four of us: my parents, Claire, and me. From the moment we arrived, I knew something was off. The smiles were too wide, the tone too rehearsed. Mom fussed over Claire like she'd never done before, asking about her work, her family, her hobbies. Dad poured me a drink and said, "Proud of you, son," like it didn't taste foreign on his tongue. I played along, watching carefully, waiting for the real reason. It came after dinner, when Mom leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on the table. "Harry," she said sweetly, "your father and I were wondering if you might help us with something. You know Ryan and Julia have so much potential, but times are tough. Maybe you could lend some guidance. Or even some support." There it was. Claire stiffened beside me, but I kept my expression neutral. "Support how?" "Well," Mom continued, her voice light, "Ryan's been looking at houses, but the market is so competitive. A little financial boost could go a long way. And Julia is considering graduate school. Tuition is outrageous these days. But you're doing so well now, aren't you? It would mean so much to the family if you shared some of your good fortune." I set my glass down slowly, carefully. "So you're asking me to fund Ryan's house and Julia's education?" Dad chuckled, as though I'd phrased it too bluntly. "Don't think of it like that. Think of it as investing in your siblings. Family helps family." I glanced at Claire, whose lips pressed into a thin line. She opened her mouth, but I squeezed her hand under the table to stop her. Not yet. I leaned back in my chair, forcing a smile. I'll think about it. Their relief was palpable. They thought they had me. But as we drove home that night, Claire turned to me, incredulous. Tell me you're not seriously considering it. Of course not, I said. But now I know. Know what? That they want something. And when people want something, they make mistakes. That was the moment the setup began. Over the following months, my career accelerated even further. The startup I'd invested in announced a partnership with a major corporation, and my small slice grew into something far more substantial. At work, I was promoted again, this time to director. My salary jumped, my network expanded, and for the first time, I found myself sitting in meetings with people whose names carried weight. But beyond the money and titles, I started realizing something more important: access. I was in rooms my family couldn't dream of entering. I was learning things about investments, property, and influence they wouldn't even know to Google. And with every new piece of knowledge, every connection made, I felt the gap between us widen. The more successful I became, the more desperate my family grew. Ryan called me out of the blue one evening. His voice was strained, uncharacteristically humble. Hey, little bro, listen, I've hit a rough patch. Car loan's overdue, and I don't really want mom and dad stressing about it. You think you could spot me just this once? I almost laughed. Ryan, the golden boy, the invincible athlete, reduced to begging me for money. Sorry, Ryan, I said calmly. My budget's tight right now. Can't help. There was a pause, then a forced chuckle. Tight? With all that startup money? Come on, Harry. I said no. I repeated and hung up. A week later, Julia reached out. She didn't even bother with small talk. So, rumor has it you're doing really well. That's great. Anyway, I was thinking of going back to school, but the scholarships are impossible to get. You'd be a hero if you helped out. Imagine how proud mom and dad would be. Not possible, I said simply. Her sigh was theatrical. Harry, you're being selfish. We're family. Family. They threw that word around like a weapon, as if the mere mention of it obligated me to bend. But with each request I denied, I noticed something shift. Their voices grew sharper, their smiles more strained. The balance of power was tilting, and they knew it. It was around this time that I learned something that would change everything. At a networking event, I struck up a conversation with a real estate developer who, as it turned out, was involved in a project in the very neighborhood Ryan had been bragging about. Out of curiosity, I asked about it. He laughed and said, "Yeah, funny thing. Some guy put in an offer on a place, but his financing fell through. House is back on the market." When he mentioned the address, my eyebrows shot up. It was the very house Ryan had been parading around on social media, acting like it was already his. That was when I realized just how precarious his situation was. Julia's wasn't much better. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned she hadn't actually applied to any graduate programs. She'd been bouncing between temp jobs, living off our parents' help, and pretending she was exploring her options. And my parents? Their finances weren't as solid as they let on either. A casual comment from my father about downsizing eventually hinted at cracks I'd never considered. Piece by piece, the facade of their superiority was crumbling. And for the first time, I wasn't the weak one. I wasn't the dependent one. I was the one holding the cards. But I didn't gloat. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I waited. I listened. I let them talk themselves into corners, reveal their weaknesses, expose their desperation. Every conversation became a thread, and I tucked each one away, weaving them into something stronger. Claire noticed, of course. One evening, as I reviewed some notes I'd jotted down after a call with my father, she leaned against the doorway. "You're planning something, aren't you?" I looked up, meeting her eyes. "I'm preparing." Her lips curved into a knowing smile. "Just make sure when the time comes, you don't hold back." That was the beauty of it. I didn't need to rush. For years, they had mocked me, belittled me, underestimated me. Now, they were walking straight into the trap of their own arrogance, and all I had to do was be patient. The old Harry would have confronted them too soon, blown everything in a fit of emotion. The new Harry understood the value of timing, and as the months rolled on, the opportunities to set up my revenge grew clearer, sharper. The wedding had been their stage, but soon it would be mine. And this time, the spotlight wouldn't humiliate me. It would expose them. The months of patient waiting had a strange way of folding into one quiet, methodical plan. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't hire a lawyer or call the press. I did what felt most like myself. I collected facts, quietly and without fanfare, and let the pieces fall into place on their own. It started with the things anyone could see if they bothered to look. Ryan's social media flexing about an address he hadn't closed on, Julia casually posting about being so stressed with grad apps, while texts to me begged for handouts, Dad's offhand comment about downscaling. That suddenly made sense when I pulled their public property records. Then I gathered the more delicate stuff, screenshots, timestamps, the flippant messages where my mother asked for help in the same breath as she mocked me in front of our relatives. I saved Mark's videos where he bragged about the best roast ever. And yes, I kept that low, mean rehearsal clip, the one I'd heard the week before the wedding where they'd practiced the jabs and laughed as if they were putting on a show. I recorded it the moment I could, not because I wanted to hurt anyone for the thrill, but because evidence turns rumor into reality. I cross-checked every claim. When Ryan bragged about a down payment he supposedly had, I contacted the agent on the listing he'd been drooling over. The agent confirmed. The buyer's financing collapsed and the house was back on the market. No, Ryan had never completed an application. For Julia, a simple phone call to the registrar at the program she'd been name-dropping revealed she'd never even submitted an application. For my parents, a look at lien filings showed that a reverse mortgage talk they joked about at brunch was closer to real than they let on. Little contradictions assembled into a portrait I already knew was true in my bones. They were not as invincible as they liked to be, and they were willing to weaponize me to hide it. I also built allies quietly. I reached out to a few of the guests who'd been at the wedding. People who'd looked uncomfortable during the toasts. People whose opinion actually mattered when it came to reputation. I slid them copies of the rehearsal clip, not as gossip, but as an ask. Did you notice this? Do you think this is appropriate? Their responses were careful, but sympathetic. A couple of them admitted they'd been waiting for someone to actually say something. I kept all of that too. And then I planned the stage. There was no better spot than the next family celebration they'd inevitably host. My parents announced they wanted to throw a small dinner to celebrate their anniversary. Just family, Mom said, with that tone that suggested it was hers to orchestrate. Claire and I accepted the invitation. It felt almost too perfect, but that's what made it right. They wanted a show. I would let them have one, just not the one they were expecting. I told no one from my side what I was planning, except Claire. She was the only person I wanted in the room who knew the truth beforehand, not because she needed to be complicit, but because I needed her steady presence. She listened to the outline of my plan and met my eyes with the kind of fierce calm that steadied me more than anything else. On the night of the dinner, the house was the same warm, deceptive space it had always been. My mother fretting over flowers, Dad playing the host, Ryan and Julia trading the practiced banter of siblings who were always on the same page. Guests arrived, a mixture of extended family, a couple neighbors, and a few of my friends I'd asked to be there just in case. The table gleamed. The candles made everything softer. They had no idea the room had been prepped for a different kind of reveal. I'd arranged it so that the program would begin after dessert. There was a projector and a small speaker tucked behind a potted plant at the edge of the living room. I told my mother it was for a slideshow of photos from her early years. Who could refuse a nostalgic parents' night? She beamed, flattered at the thought. Her willingness to take center stage made the bait all the sweeter. When the coffee was poured and the talk lulled, I stood up. I felt my heart thud, not with fear, but with the strange calm that comes from standing at the lip of something consequential. I raised my glass, and in a voice that carried across polished wood and polite smiles, said, I know this evening is about Mom and Dad, and I want to honor them. But before we raise a proper toast, there are a few things I'd like everyone here to see. Things I think deserve hearing directly from family before strangers have to. Mom's smile faltered. Ryan's eyebrows climbed. Mark muttered something under his breath. The projector hummed to life. I tested it once that afternoon while pretending to help with their playlist, and the first slide came up, a casual photo of the rehearsal dinner. The sound rose, and with it, a clip of voices, laughing in the way I'd heard them months before. The sound was unmistakable. We'll make him look like a joke in front of his bride, Mark said, then Ryan's chuckle. The room's air seemed to change. A cousin who'd been mid-sip froze. fork halfway to mouth. I let the laughter hang over their faces for a beat. Then came a series of juxtaposed images and messages projected silently, but clearly. Ryan's post with the boast about the house we just bought, beside a screenshot of the agent's note. Offer fell through. Financing not approved. Julia's grad school. Insta story beside an email from a program coordinator confirming no application on file. Mom's text to me about helping the kids beside her Facebook post mocking my boring little life at the family barbecue. For extra measure, I slid in a cleaned-up clip of the toasts at our wedding. Selected lines, placed next to the rehearsal snippet. The room's chatter fell into a hush so loud I could hear the tick of a clock somewhere in the next room. I watched their faces as the truths appeared. My mother's hand found my father's under the table. He squeezed it like that would steady him. Ryan's jaw set like a man trying to keep a laugh from escaping. Julia's smile dissolved into something thinner, like a mask being removed. Mom's eyes darted to Mark. He was pale, embarrassed, and furious all at once. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The images spoke with a clarity that sarcasm never could. After a few minutes of absorbing the montage, I turned the projector off and let the final slide. A blank white screen settle on the wall. The silence was total. You could have heard cicadas. Then Claire stood. She spoke first, not in accusation, but in fact. We invited you all here because family matters, she said, voice steady. And because we believe family should be honest with one another. These things happened. We can either talk about them, now, or pretend they didn't and let them keep happening. My mother's face flushed, her lips trembled. For the first time I saw something like fear in her eyes, and I felt a pang that surprised me. The old muscle memory of wanting to fix, to forgive, to be forgiven. I set my napkin down and looked around the table at the people who had made my wedding a spectacle. Why? Mom asked, voice small. Why would you do this? Because, I said, calm and deliberate. When something is done to humiliate and erase you on purpose, it needs to be named. You practiced humiliation. You celebrated humiliating me. And when people do that, it tells the rest of the world what's acceptable in this family. Ryan laughed at first, a thin, defensive bark. Come on, Harry. It was a joke. Can't you take a joke? You asked me earlier what I was going to do, I replied. You said it like it was a given I wouldn't do anything. So I did the thing you never expected. I listened, I documented, and I gave you a choice in front of people who matter. The choice I offered wasn't dramatic. I didn't hand down ultimatums or legal threats. I didn't humiliate them in return with insults. Instead, I said two things quietly and clearly. First, that I would no longer be the family ATM, counselor, or punchline. And second, that if they wanted any help from me in the future, there would be accountability and openness. No more secret requests, no more behind-the-scenes manipulations. If they needed me, they would ask honestly, or not at all. That, I thought, was measured, almost merciful. But the measure of mercy depends on context, and they clearly had not expected anything like this from me. There was an intake of breath, sharp, collective. My father looked betrayed, like the ground had slid out from under some long-held narrative he'd used to justify his choices. Julia's face was a flash of anger and shame. Ryan's mouth trembled in a way that suggested he might either explode or crumble. Then Mark stood up abruptly, chair scraping back. You can't do this, Harry, he said, voice high. You had no right to record us. That's a violation. You had no right to plan my humiliation, I said, and the room contracted around those words. He pointed at me, fury distorting his face. This is petty. You're being petty. I looked at him, really looked, and for a heartbeat the old doubt seized me. Did I cross a line? Was I stooping to their level? Then I remembered every joke at my expense, every belittling comment, the way my parents had laughed while Claire's family stared in disbelief. I remembered the sick, hollow feeling of being used as entertainment on the most important night of my life. No, I answered, voice low, and that was the end of my doubt. This is not petty. This is boundary setting. A dozen small conversations tried to start at once. Aunt Claire, not my wife, asked for clarification. A neighbor murmured that perhaps matters should be handled privately. My father opened his mouth and closed it again. I let them talk. I let them sputter. I let them run out of steam. The reveal had been calm, precise, surgical, and that was intentional. I wanted this to be the moment they could not laugh away, could not rewrite by sheer force of family lore. When the initial shock began to ebb into awkward questions, I stood up, gathered my coat, and smiled in a way I hadn't smiled in years. Not smug, not triumphant, simply unburdened. "Think about what you want your family to be," I said quietly as I put my hand on Claire's back. "I'm done being the family joke. I'll be here for people who are honest, who ask in good faith, and who are willing to change. The rest of it, I'll let the consequences of your choices speak for themselves." I walked out into the night with Claire at my side. Behind me, the conversation picked up again, louder now, full of self-justifications and sharp breaths. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The montage had done its work. The record was out. We reached the car, and Claire squeezed my hand. "You okay?" she asked, voice soft. I felt a strange, new kind of lightness, but also a coiled tension that told me the fight wasn't over. "I am," I said, "but this isn't finished. They'll respond. People don't like being exposed." She nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. "So what now?" I took a breath and looked at her, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a man waiting on their permission to be whole. I felt like someone who had finally decided to write his own story. "We wait," I said, "and we watch." Behind the closed door of the house, muffled and sharp, I could already hear the first fractured sentences of the fallout beginning. The low, panicked calls, the whispered consultations, the hurried texts that would circle through family and friends. My stomach clenched at the thought, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation, a readiness for what would come next. I started the car, and as we pulled away from the warm light of the family home, the night seemed to hold its breath with us. The drive home after the anniversary dinner was oddly quiet. Claire had her hand resting on mine, her thumb tracing slow, steady circles, but neither of us spoke. It wasn't because we didn't have anything to say. It was because we both knew the fallout was already beginning behind us, back at that glowing house where my family's fortress of superiority had just cracked wide open. The text started that very night. First came one from Julia, angry and venomous. "How dare you air private family stuff like that? You embarrassed us in front of everyone. You're disgusting, Harry." Then one from Ryan, more bluster than substance. "Enjoy your little victory. Everyone knows you're petty. You'll regret this." By morning, Mom had sent a long, rambling message that shifted between guilt-tripping and pleading. "We were just having fun. Families tease. You've blown everything out of proportion. But you're still our son, and I don't want this rift to last forever. Please, call me." I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I went to work as if nothing had happened. I carried myself the same way I had been carrying myself for the past year. Calm, professional, focused. And it was strange, almost liberating, how quickly the silence between me and them started to feel like peace rather than absence. But silence never lasts in families like mine. Within a week, the ripple effects began to show. An aunt called me quietly, thanking me. "I always hated how they treated you," she admitted. "It wasn't right. But no one ever stood up to them before. What you did, it needed to be done." A cousin messaged me privately, saying, "I didn't realize how rehearsed it all was. Seeing the video, it changed everything. They can't just pretend anymore." Those little confirmations weren't loud, but they mattered. They proved I hadn't imagined it, hadn't exaggerated. Other people had seen the truth once it was laid bare. Meanwhile, Ryan's bravado started to crumble. Word spread among the family about his failed house purchase, and when he tried to brag at the next neighborhood gathering, someone called him out. Didn't financing fall through on that place? He was forced to laugh it off, but the shine was gone. His image of the golden, untouchable son had a dent in it now, and dents, once made, are hard to polish away. Julia fared no better. Her grad school journey became a running joke after a cousin asked her, in front of everyone, how applications were going. She stammered, fumbled, then muttered something about taking a gap year. Behind her back, people whispered the truth. Her credibility, the carefully curated persona of the ambitious, intelligent younger sibling, had been punctured. As for my parents, their carefully constructed role as the proud, flawless heads of the family began to weaken. People had heard the recordings. They couldn't deny them. Neighbors looked at them differently. Extended relatives treated them with a politeness that had an edge, as if they were careful now, wary of aligning too closely with them. None of this was because I'd screamed or demanded punishment. It was because I'd let their own actions stand in the light. And actions, when stripped of spin, carry their own consequences. The calls from my parents became more desperate as weeks went on. My mother left voicemails, her tone slipping from stern to trembling. "Harry, please, we can work this out. You don't understand what you've done to this family." My father, who rarely used words like sorry, left one short message. "Son, maybe we went too far." But I didn't call back, because the truth was, they hadn't just gone too far at the wedding. That night was simply the culmination of years of small cruelties, years of choosing Ryan and Julia's egos over my dignity, years of laughing while I stood silent. My silence had been their permission slip, and they'd used it freely. Now the permission was revoked. It wasn't all vindication, though. There were days when guilt tugged at me, when I heard my mother's voice on a voicemail and felt that old ache in my chest, the ache of wanting to be accepted, to belong. But Claire reminded me, gently but firmly, "They made their choices, Harry. This isn't punishment. It's accountability." And she was right. The months that followed saw a quiet but undeniable shift. At family gatherings, the few we attended, my parents were subdued, watchful. Ryan kept his stories short, and Julia avoided making jabs. The laughter that used to come at my expense no longer filled the room. There were still smiles, still surface-level chatter, but the undercurrent had changed. The hierarchy they had enforced for so long had fractured. And for the first time, I wasn't walking into those rooms as the middle child defined by their ridicule. I was walking in as my own man, confident, respected, untouchable in ways they had never imagined. The real revenge wasn't the slideshow or the recordings. It wasn't exposing them in front of others. The real revenge was living a life they could no longer control, no longer diminish, no longer claim ownership of. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very night they had chosen to humiliate me, my wedding, had been the catalyst for all of it. Their cruelty had backfired, setting me on a path that ended with me stronger than I'd ever been. And the fallout wasn't just theirs. It was mine too. I shed the last remnants of the boy who swallowed insults and stayed quiet. I became the man who stood, calmly, and said, "Enough." 1 year after the anniversary dinner, Claire and I hosted a gathering of our own, a celebration of our new home, purchased with money I'd earned and invested on my own terms. We invited friends, colleagues, and a few extended relatives. We didn't invite Ryan. We didn't invite Julia. My parents were given the choice, and they declined, Mom citing not feeling well. As I stood in the living room, surrounded by people who respected me for who I was, not who my family claimed I was, I felt the quiet satisfaction settle deep. The cycle had been broken. The boy they had laughed at was gone, and the man they had underestimated had taken his place. I raised my glass that evening, looking around at the room filled with warmth and laughter, laughter that healed rather than cut. My voice carried clear and steady as I said, "Here's to writing your own story and never letting anyone else hold the pen."